Unit 20 Economic Reforms in India. You have learnt in the previous units that after independence the state was assigned the predominant role under the belief that resources could be better allocated by a planning authority. Licensing was considered the best way to manage the limited resources. However, over the years it was experienced that such a system was inefficient and lead only to corruption, delay and inefficiency. Since July 1991, economic reforms have been introduced. These new policy measures seek to redefine the role of the state and market so as to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system. In this unit, after discussing the rationale for economic reforms, we shall explain the terms privatization, liberalization, and globalization. We shall also examine to what extent economic reforms have achieved the goals of our development strategies. Let us begin with explaining the meaning of economic reforms and rationale behind them. Economic 20.2 Economic Reforms Rationale. Since the inception of planning growth with social justice and self-reliance have remained the central objectives of development strategy, import substitution, licenses and controls coupled with dominant role of public sector in economic activities were the peculiar features of development strategies till July 1991. License, permit, quota raj lead to widespread corruption. The bureaucracy was the principal beneficiary of this system. The government officials, in collusion with the political bosses, earned huge money via corruption. Hence, it was increasingly felt to dismantle the system of licensing and control. Quite a large number of public enterprises, which played crucial role in setting up heavy and basic industries, social and economic infrastructural development, were facing problem of inefficiency and high cost of operation. Further, there was a high pressure of the World Trade Organization to expose Indian industry to face world competition. The performance of the Indian economy was not up to expectations. All these factors made the government to introduce the economic reforms. The industrial policy announced in 1991 provided following rationale for introducing economic reforms. Number 1. To decontrol the Indian industrial economy from unnecessary bureaucratic controls. Second, to introduce liberalization with a view to integrate the Indian economy with the world economy. Number 3. To remove the restrictions on foreign direct investment. Number 4. To remove the restrictions of MRTP Act. And number 5. To shed the load of public sector enterprises, which has shown a very low rate of return and incurring losses over the years. Constituents of economic reforms. Economic reforms in India refer to the set of instruments and strategies adopted since 1991. Liberalization, privatisation, and globalization are the three constituents of economic reforms. Let us discuss all these three constituents one by one. Liberalization of the economy. In the context of economic reforms, liberalization refers to shifting of license-dominated regime to delicensing, deregulation and debureaucratization. India has taken following measures towards liberalizing the economy. Removal of industrial licensing, except 18 industries relating to security and strategic concerns, social reasons, hazardous chemicals and overriding environmental. All industrial licensing was abolished. Subsequently, this list was reduced to a small group of 5 industries. De-reservation of SSI items. The items earlier reserved for SSI sector are gradually being de-reserved. In the budget 2003 to 4, 75 items and 2005 to 6, 108 items have been deserved. Thus, the small-scale industry has been forced to face both domestic and international competition. Withdrawing MRTP restrictions. The provisions for MRTP companies for clearance of investment proposals have been withdrawn. This has freed big business houses to undertake expansion and establishment of new undertakings as well as to undertake mergers, amalgamations and takeovers. They have also been given the freedom to freedom in the appointment of directors. This has provided a more liberal environment for expansion of existing undertakings and setting up of new undertakings. Privatization of the economy. Privatization refers to any process that reduces the involvement of state or public sector in economic activities of a nation. In a narrow sense, privatization refers to the induction of private ownership in a public sector undertaking. In a broader sense, it implies the enlargement of the scope of the private sector in the growth of the economy. Privatization in the narrow sense can take the following forms. A. Total denationalization. This implies complete transfer of ownership of a public enterprise to private hands. Some examples of total denationalizations are Alvin Nishan was handed over to Mahindra, Mangalore Chemical and Fertilizers to UB Group and Maharashtra Scooters, UB Group and Maharashtra Scooters to Bajaj Auto India. Joint venture. This implies partial induction of private ownership from 25 to 50% or even more in public sector enterprise depending upon the nature of the enterprise and state policy in this regard. C. Workers' cooperative. Transfer of ownership of a loss-making concern to the workers in another form of privatization. The basic logic of proposal is that workers, besides receiving wages for work, would also be entitled to a share in ownership dividend. Since workers' personal interest is linked to the interest of the enterprise, the workers are likely to work hard to increase productivity so that they can earn more. Such schemes were introduced in Kamai Tubes, Central Jute and Mewar Textiles, etc. Token privatization. The sale of 5% to 10% shares of a profit-making public sector enterprise in the market is known as token privatization. The objective of such privatization is to obtain revenue to reduce budget deficit. Out of the various forms of privatization, the most acceptable is the joint venture, in which the share of the private sector is kept at either 49% or 74%. But simply a change of ownership is not sufficient to increase productivity and profitability. For this purpose, other measures like linking wages to productivity, changing promotion policy based on the efficiency of the workers is needed so that a competitive environment is created in which efficiency pricing becomes a norm. The following steps have been taken towards privatization of the Indian economy. Permitting the entry of the private corporate sector in such core sectors as steel, telecommunication, ports, airlines and power. And no fresh budgetary support for public sector enterprises. This will lead to dilution of government equity in most of these PSEs, which decide to go in for new projects and expansion. No new central public sector undertaking will be set up in the country. Issue of equity to the public by the identified PSUs and outright sale of identified PSUs. Disinvestment. As part of the ongoing privatization, the shares of public sector undertakings are being sold in the market with the objective of obtaining revenue to reduce budget deficit. This policy has been referred to as disinvestments. The data for targets and actual disinvestments from April 1991 onwards are given below. In a democratic society like India, it is not possible to carry out privatization in total disregard of interests of workers. In spite of having a strong case for privatization of certain PSUs, it has become increasingly difficult to push through proposals of privatization in reality due to following reasons. First, with the emergence of strong trade unions in India, privatization in the sense of total denationalization is not acceptable to trade unions. The trade unions of all shades, left, center, and right, are all opposed to privatization of profit making PSUs. Consequently, the government is forced to slow down its pace of disinvestments. Secondly, using book value of net assets in disinvestments by the state results in gross undervaluation of assets. As a result of it, the assets are transferred to big businesses at very low prices. Thirdly, the state's intention of encouragement of corporatization and thereby providing benefit to big business houses is also opposed. It is argued that instead of total denationalization, the workers' cooperative forms of privatization should be adopted, as was done in the case of Kamani tubes. Fourthly, in the privatization process, workers' retrenchment through the route of voluntary retirement schemes in respect of sick units of PSUs is also opposed by the workers. Lastly, the absence of a social security system in India is another major cause of opposition to privatization. Unless the problems associated with privatization are taken care of in a proper and honest manner, the resistance to privatization will continue. Globalization of the economy. Globalization means the economic integration of the country with the rest of the world. In other words, it is a process of integrating the various economies of the world without creating any hindrance in the flow of goods and services, technology, capital, and labor. This involves four components. Number one, reduction of trade barriers in the form of custom duties or quantitative restrictions or quotas so as to permit free flow of goods and services among different economies. Number two, creation of an environment in which free flow of capital can take place between nation and states. Third, creation of an environment for free flow of technology. And fourth, creation of an environment in which free flow of labor or human resources can take place among different countries of the world. Advantages of globalization. Globalization generates many advantages for a developing economy like India. Among these, the more important ones can be briefly summed up as follows. Globalization helps in removing inefficiency. In the absence of globalization, prolonged protection of domestic industry has serious damaging effects on cost structure. Industries habitually fall asleep under protective umbrellas and become careless about cost. Globalization serves to give a boost to the long run average growth rate of the economy by number one, improving the allocative efficiency of resources, number two, reducing the capital output ratio, and number three, increasing the labor productivity. Globalization helps to restructure the production and trade pattern in favor of labor intensive goods and labor intensive techniques. Foreign capital is attracted to exploit the professional export opportunities along the above lines. With the entry of foreign capital, updated technology also enters the country. With the entry of foreign competition and the removal of import tariff barriers, domestic industry will be subject to price reducing and quality improving effects in the domestic economy. Uneconomic import substitution will slowly disappear and cheaper imports, particularly of capital goods, will reduce the capital output ratio in manufacturing. Lower prices of manufactured goods will improve the terms of trade in favor of agriculture. The main effect of globalization is felt in the consumer goods industries. As there is a large domestic demand for these goods, employment opportunities would expand and over a period of time, the trickle-down effect will operate and the proportion of people below the poverty line will go down. It is also believed that the efficiency of banking and financial sectors will increase with the opening of these areas to foreign capital and foreign banks. Disadvantages of globalization. Globalization has its pitfalls also. Among these, the more important ones can be identified as follows. Globalization process is in essence a tremendous redistribution of economic power at the world level. This will increasingly translate into redistribution of economic power. Economically weak nations may be dominated by economically powerful nations. Globalization process challenges some familiar assumptions. Until now, for instance, it was conventional wisdom that technological change and increases in productivity would translate into more jobs and higher wages. But in the last few years, technological changes have eliminated more jobs than they have created. It is becoming harder in the industrially developed democratic countries to ask the public to go through the pains and uncertainties of structural adjustment for the sake of benefits yet to come. Globalization has sounded the death knell of village and small industries. These cannot stand up to competition against the well organized MNCs. In short, the human and social cost of globalization multiply to a level that tests the social fabric of the democracies in an unprecedented way. It implies that the efforts of focusing on training and education, on the constant overhauling of telecommunication and transport infrastructures, on entrepreneur incentive fiscal policies has to be a central part of a national competitiveness policy going beyond the traditional concept of economic policy. Globalization of the Indian economy. The following measures have been taken towards globalization of the Indian economy. Number 1. Automatic approval for direct foreign investment up to 51% foreign equity ownerships in a wide range of industries. Earlier, all foreign investments were limited to 40%. Second, automatic permission for foreign technology agreements, royalty payments up to 5% of domestic sales or 8% of export sales or lump sum payment of Rs 10 million. Automatic approval for all other royalty payments will also be given if the projects can generate internally the foreign exchange required. Third, with a view to provide access to international markets, majority foreign equity holdings up to 51% equity would be allowed for trading companies primarily engaged in export activities. Fourth, as a part of shift in policy orientation from import substitution to export promotion, tariff rates were reduced and quantitative controls over imports were removed. Quantitative restrictions were replaced by price-based system. Other measures include setting up of special economic zones, aligning EXIM procedures with WTO norms, removal of disincentives, export promotion through import entitlement. Consequent upon opening the category of export lead growth during the last 15 years, Indian exports as a percentage of GDP have gone up to 5.8% in 1992-91 to 11.1% in 2004 to 5. Along with this, imports have also gone up from 8.8% of GDP to 13.8% during the same period. Similarly, foreign direct investment flows, which were a mere trickle in 1990 to 91 of the order of $97 million, shoots up to 6,130 million in 2003 and 4. Another major benefit of globalization has been the sharp increase in export of invisible items, especially software exports. A unique achievement of globalization is the increase of our net software export earnings to a level of 23.41 billion in 2003 to 4. India has started thinking in terms of reaching international standards in productivity and thus competing effectively in the global market. 24. Assessment of economic reforms. In the first and second 5-year plans, the goals of economic development were identified as under: number 1, a higher rate of growth of GDP. Second, enlargement of employment potential leading to full employment. Third, removal of poverty. Fourth, promotion of equity in distribution of income. And fifth, removal of regional disparity between the rich and the poor states. On the basis of these goals, economic reforms can be assessed as under: number 1, it is argued by the proponents of economic growth that the reform process accelerates the economic growth. The annual average growth rate of GDP during the decade of 1990 was about 6% against the average GDP growth rate of 5.5% during the pre-reform period. That is between 1980-81 and 1990-91. Presently, the economy is all set to grow at a still higher rate of 7.0%, which may go on to become and even exceed 8%. Thus, the reform process to a certain extent has been successful in obtaining high GDP growth rate. Second, the growth rate of employment declined from 2.39% per annum during 1983 and 1990-91 to a mere 1% per annum during 1990-91 to 1999-2000. The growth rate of employment in organized sector was merely 0.6%. This was just one-third of the growth of employment witnessed in the pre-reform period. The growth rate of unorganized sector, which was of the order of 2.41% during the pre-reform period, also declined to 1.1% in the post-reform period. This decline in the employment indicates the state of jobless growth. Third, poverty ratio declined from 36% to 26.1% in 1999 to 2000. However, the rate of poverty reduction, which was around 3.1% per annum during the period 83 to 91, reversed to 1% in 1990s, that is between 1991 and 1997. Thus, an inverse relationship is observed between GDP growth and poverty reduction. This reflects that the benefit of growth do not reach to the poor. Fourth, during the pre-reform period of the total man days lost, 53.8% were accounted for by the strikes and remaining 46.2% were due to the lockouts. However, in the post-reform period, that is 1991 to 2000, the proportion of man days lost due to strikes come down to 39.8% and shares of lockouts increased to 60.2%. Thus, in the post-reform period, proportion of man days lost due to lockouts was much higher in the post-reform period than in the pre-reform period. This shows that due to privatization, the policy of reforms, the employers' militancy has increased and the workers have been put in much vulnerable position. Fifth, the quality of employment has also deteriorated in the post-reform period. The share of casual labor in the total workforce, which was 32% in 1993 to 94, rose to 33.2% in 1999 to 2000. All these facts indicate that labor has been adversely affected by the economic reforms. Sixth, the agriculture sector has been neglected in the reform period. The growth rate of agriculture declined from 3.7% per annum during pre-reform period to only 2.9% in the post-reform period. Seventh, economic reforms have aggravated regional disparities by favoring the forward states. The ratio of maximum and minimum net state domestic product NSDP has increased from 2.7 in 1990 to 91 to 4.6 in 2001. Thus, regional disparities in terms of growth of NSDP, both total and per capita, has widened further. Summary. Since inception of planning, growth and social justice and self-reliance have been the central objectives of development strategy. Import substitution, licenses and controls are coupled with the dominant role of public sector in economic activities were the peculiar features of development strategy. Till July 1991. This led to widespread corruption and inefficiency. The economic reforms introduced since July 1991 seek to redefine the role of state and market. Liberalization, privatization, globalization are the three constituents of economic reforms. Except for five industries, all industrial licensing have been abolished. Small scale industries have been forced to face domestic and international competition. Total denationalization, joint venture, workers' cooperatives, etc., are the various forms of privatization. Due to various reasons, privatization is resisted by trade unions. Globalization is the process of integrating the various economies of the world through flow of goods and services, capital, technology, and labor. Due to globalization, India's export earnings, particularly our net software earnings, have improved, whereas in the post-reform period, the growth performance of Indian economy has been quite impressive. The decline in the employment growth rate, deterioration in the equity of employment, slowing down the poverty reduction rate, neglection of agriculture sector and widening regional disparities have become issues of concern.